Hey guys, tonight we begin with a departure. We are standing on the banks of the River Thames in May of 1845. The air is filled with the smell of coal smoke, wet timber, and the nervous electric energy of an empire at its peak. The Victorian era was a time of absolute confidence. It was a time when men believed they had conquered nature through steam, through iron, and through sheer force of will. There was no mountain too high, no jungle too dense, and no ocean too cold. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from, and if you prefer the cold of winter or the heat of summer. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you were standing on the docks at Greenhithe that morning, you would have seen two of the most magnificent machines ever built by human hands. Their names were the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror. These were not graceful, sleek racing ships. They were beasts. They were bomb vessels, originally designed to fire massive mortars at enemy fortifications. They were built to be heavy, wide, and incredibly strong. And for this mission, they had been fortified even further. The British Admiralty had stripped them down and rebuilt them into floating fortresses. Their bows were reinforced with sheet iron to smash through the pack ice of the Arctic. Their hulls were doubled and then tripled with layers of oak and elm, creating a skin so thick that it felt impenetrable. But the true marvel lay deep inside the belly of the ships. For the first time in polar history, these ships were not reliant solely on the wind. They were fitted with locomotive steam engines, repurposed from the railways. A retractable screw propeller could be lowered into the water, allowing the ships to push forward at 4 knots, even when the wind was dead calm. They had a heating system, a series of pipes running hot water through the cabins to keep the sailors warm. They had a desalination device to turn salt water into fresh. To the Victorian public watching from the shore, these ships looked like spaceships. They were the apex of technology, the unsinkable iron will of England sent to conquer the last white blank spot on the map, the Northwest Passage. The sheer scale of the supplies on board is difficult to comprehend. Sir John Franklin, the expedition's leader, wasn't planning a quick dash through the ice. He was planning a siege. He prepared his men to survive for 3, perhaps even 4 years, completely cut off from the rest of the world. The cargo holds of the Erebus and Terror were packed with over 60,000 pounds of flour, 30,000 pounds of salt beef and pork, 9,000 pounds of chocolate, and a new technological miracle, tinned food. 8,000 tins of soup, meat and vegetables, sealed in lead and tin, promising fresh nutrients long after the fresh food ran out. It was supposed to be their salvation. It was supposed to be the thing that prevented scurvy and starvation. But the preparation didn't stop at survival. The Victorians believed that to maintain discipline, you had to maintain civilization. You couldn't just survive the Arctic, you had to ignore it. So they packed luxuries. They brought fine china plates, crystal glasses, and heavy sterling silver cutlery. They brought mahogany writing desks so the officers could write their journals in comfort. They brought a library. Between the two ships, there were nearly 3,000 books, Bibles, novels, scientific manuals, and poetry. They brought musical instruments, violins, flutes, and even a mechanical hand organ to play tunes for them during the long, dark nights. They brought a daguerreotype camera to take the first photographs of the ice. It was, in every sense, a piece of London detached and sent north. They were bringing their world with them. They believed that if they surrounded themselves with enough books, enough silver, and enough steam power, the Arctic couldn't touch them. It was the ultimate hubris, the belief that technology could insulate you from the primal forces of the earth. As the supplies were loaded, crate after crate, the waterline of the ships sank lower and lower. They were heavy. They were slow. They were bloated with the weight of civilization. And hidden amongst those thousands of tins of food was a microscopic flaw, a tiny, invisible mistake in the manufacturing process of the lead solder, a mistake that no one noticed on the sunny docks of the Thames, but that would become a nightmare in the freezing dark. The man chosen to lead this massive endeavour was Sir John Franklin. He was 59 years old, by the standards of the time, an old man. He was overweight, kind-hearted, and deeply religious. He was not a young, fiery explorer. He was a man looking for one last glory. He had been to the Arctic before, decades earlier. He had nearly starved to death on an overland trek, earning him the nickname the man who ate his boots. He knew the cold. He knew the hunger. But looking at his massive, steam-powered ships, he felt safe. On the morning of the departure, the mood was euphoric. Crowds cheered. Bands played Rule Britannia. The officers, in their crisp blue uniforms with gold buttons, waved from the deck. They looked like conquerors. There was no fear in their eyes, only the certainty of success. One officer, writing a final letter home, famously said, "I cannot imagine any scenario in which we do not succeed." As the Erebus and the Terror pulled away from the dock, chugging smoke into the grey sky, they looked unstoppable. They sailed north, stopping briefly in the Orkney Islands, and then Greenland, to take on fresh water and offload final letters. In late July of 1845, two whaling ships in Baffin Bay, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, spotted them. The whalers hailed Franklin. They reported that the crew was in high spirits, waiting for the ice to open up so they could cross into Lancaster Sound. The captains waved goodbye. The whalers turned south, back toward home and safety. Franklin and his 128 men turned west. The two black ships, smoke pouring from their funnels, sailed into a white mist. They moved slowly, heavy with their silver and their secrets, toward the labyrinth of ice. The whalers watched them go until they were just specks on the horizon. And then the mist swallowed them. That was the last time anyone in the civilized world would see them alive. The door had closed. The noise of the steam engines faded into the howl of the wind. They had left the world of men and entered the world of the ice. And the ice was waiting. The summer of 1845 began with a deception. As the Erebus and Terror pushed west into Lancaster Sound, the Arctic seemed to welcome them. The water was open. The sun circled the sky in a perpetual, unblinking loop. For 24 hours a day, the light reflected off the icebergs, turning the world into a dazzling kaleidoscope of white and blue. Franklin and his men must have felt invincible. They sailed up the Wellington Channel, exploring, mapping, making excellent time. The steam engines hummed. The sailors stood on deck, smoking pipes, watching narwhals break the surface. They were making history. But the Arctic summer is a fleeting ghost. It promises freedom, but it is only a pause in the eternal freeze. In late August, the temperature dropped. The water began to thicken. It started as grease ice, a thin, oily film on the surface. Then came the pancake ice, small floating disks that bumped gently against the hull. And then, almost overnight, the gates closed. The floating pans of ice cemented together. The open leads of water vanished. The Erebus and Terror, massive technological marvels, were suddenly stripped of their power. Their steam engines were useless against millions of tons of frozen ocean. They were no longer ships. They were buildings, locked in a foundation of ice. Franklin gave the order to winter. They found a small, sheltered bay off the coast of a desolate spit of land called Beachy Island. It was a bleak, gravelly place. No trees, no bushes, just grey stones and wind. But the crew wasn't worried. This was part of the plan. They anchored the ships. They built an observatory on the shore. They set up a shooting range. As the sun dipped below the horizon for the last time that year, plunging them into months of twilight and darkness, they retreated inside. They sealed the hatches. They draped heavy canvas tents over the decks to trap the heat. The steam pipes hissed to life, circulating hot water through the cabins. Outside, the temperature plummeted to 40, then 50 degrees below zero. But inside, it was England. Life at Beachy Island was a surreal performance of normalcy. To keep morale high, and to keep the darkness of the mind at bay, the officers organized a Royal Arctic Theatre. They built a stage on the deck. They sewed costumes out of old flags and calico. Imagine the scene. Outside, a blizzard is screaming, a sound like 1,000 crying voices. But inside the ship, 129 men are laughing. They are watching their shipmates perform a comedy, dressed in wigs and dresses. They are drinking hot chocolate. They are singing shanties. They set up a school for the illiterate sailors, teaching them to read and write by lamplight. They held divine services on Sundays. It was a microcosm of Victorian society, functioning perfectly in the middle of a frozen wasteland. But beneath the laughter, there was a subtle, creeping unease. The steam heating system, while warm, had a side effect. It made the ships damp. Condensation dripped from the walls. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and coal smoke. And the men started to cough. It wasn't scurvy, not yet. It was something else, a weakness, a lethargy. Men who had been strong when they left London found themselves winded after climbing a ladder. They complained of headaches. They became irritable. The doctors on board, Stephen Stanley and Harry Goodsir, prescribed rest. They assumed it was the cold, or perhaps the closeness of the quarters. But they were missing the invisible killer. Every time a sailor opened a tin of soup or a canister of tobacco, they were ingesting microscopic amounts of lead. The solder used to seal the thousands of tins had been applied messily, dripping into the food inside. Day by day, meal by meal, the neurotoxin was building up in their blood. It was slow, it was silent, and it was deadly. On New Year's Day, 1846, the illusion of safety shattered. The first man died. His name was John Torrington. He was a stoker, a young man only 20 years old. He worked in the engine room, breathing in coal dust and fumes. He had sickened rapidly, coughing up blood, his body wasting away until he was little more than a skeleton. Death on an expedition wasn't unheard of, but to lose a young man in the first winter with full rations and warmth was ominous. 3 days later, on January 4th, a second man died, John Hartnell. He was 25. And in April, a third man, William Brain. The crew had to perform a task that is difficult to imagine. They had to bury their friends in rock-hard permafrost. The ground at Beachy Island is frozen solid for hundreds of feet down. Picks and shovels bounce off it like iron. The sailors had to chip away at the gravel, inch by painful inch in the freezing dark. They managed to dig down only a few feet. It wasn't deep enough, but it had to do. They dressed the bodies in their best clothes. They placed them in simple wooden coffins, and, in a gesture of tenderness that would haunt archaeologists a century later, they placed a plaque on Torrington's coffin. Then they filled the graves. They erected 3 wooden headboards, carved with the names and dates. 3 lonely markers standing in the grey gravel, facing the endless ice. "Choose ye this day whom ye will serve," read the inscription on Brain's grave. The crew stood in the cold wind, listening to the prayers. They looked at the 3 mounds. They looked at their ships, locked in the ice. They thought they were escaping death, but they were sailing straight into the trap. Summer 1846. If you were a betting man on the docks of London, this was the moment you would have doubled down on Franklin's success. The Erebus and Terror had left the graves of Beachy Island behind. They had turned south, sailing into a body of water known as Peel Sound. At the time, this was a blank spot on the map. No European eyes had ever seen it. And miraculously, it was open. The summer sun had melted the pack ice into slush. A wide, dark lane of water stretched out before them, leading straight south. To Franklin, standing on the quarterdeck, this must have looked like the highway to the Pacific. The mood on board shifted from mourning to exhilaration. The death of the 3 men was a tragedy, yes, but the mission was alive. They were making progress. The steam engines churned, the propellers spun, and the ships cut through the water at full speed. They steamed past limestone cliffs, past desolate islands, getting closer and closer to the known waters of the American coast. If they could just connect the dots, if they could just push through a few hundred more miles, they would be the greatest explorers of the age. But geography is cruel. Franklin didn't know it, but he was sailing into a funnel. To the west of King William Island, there is a massive, relentless stream of ice that pours down from the high Arctic. It is old ice, multi-year ice. Blocks as hard as concrete and as big as cathedrals, driven south by the currents of the Beaufort Sea. It acts like a conveyor belt, feeding millions of tons of frozen debris into a bottleneck. And in September of 1846, just as the days began to shorten, the Erebus and Terror arrived at that bottleneck. The open water didn't just disappear, it was crushed. It happened on September 12th, 1846. The temperature dropped, the wind shifted, and the conveyor belt of ice slammed shut. This wasn't the gentle pancake ice of the previous year.
This was violence. Massive floes, some 20 feet thick, collided with the ships. The sound would have been deafening. The shriek of timber against ice, the groan of iron bolts being stretched to their breaking point. The Erebus and Terror were strong, but they were not invincible. The ice grabbed them. It lifted them out of the water, tilting them at awkward angles. Imagine trying to sleep, trying to eat in a world that is constantly screaming. The hull popping, the beams cracking, the sensation that the ship is being squeezed by a giant hand. Franklin ordered the men to fight. They brought out the ice saws, massive blades, 20 feet long, suspended from tripods. Dozens of men would haul on ropes, lifting and dropping the saw, trying to cut a channel through the ice to free the ship. They used gunpowder. They blasted the ice, creating black craters and plumes of water. They fired up the boilers, trying to use the steam engines to ram their way out. The ships shuddered, the propellers thrashed, smoke poured into the pristine air. But the ice, it didn't care. It simply closed back up. For days they fought, exhausting, back-breaking labor in freezing temperatures, but for every foot they gained, the drift carried them back too. Finally, the order came, bank the fires. They were going nowhere. The steam engines fell silent. The propellers were hoisted up. The fight was over. They were beset, stuck fast in the pack ice, roughly 15 miles off the northwest coast of King William Island. But this time there was no sheltered bay. There was no shoreline to build an observatory on. They were drifting in the middle of a frozen ocean, completely exposed to the winds of the pole.
As the second winter settled in, the psychological landscape of the expedition changed. Beachy Island had been a waiting room. This felt like a prison cell. The ships were now listing, tilted by the pressure of the ice. It meant that you could never stand up straight. Your soup bowl slid across the table. You slept on a slant. It was a constant, subtle disorientation that wore down the nerves. The view from the deck was terrifying. In every direction, as far as the eye could see, was a chaotic jumble of white ridges. Broken, jagged blocks of ice piled up like ruins. No open water, no escape. And the cold returned with a vengeance. To save coal, Franklin ordered the steam heating system to be turned down. The interior of the ship grew colder. The dampness increased. Ice began to form on the inside of the walls, on the bolts of the cabins. The men slept in hammocks that were never quite dry. Their breath froze in the air. And the silence returned, but this time the laughter of the Royal Arctic Theatre was a little more forced. The songs were a little quieter, because everyone knew deep down that something was wrong. They were supposed to be in the Pacific by now. They were supposed to be heroes. Instead, they were motionless statues, drifting slowly with the pack. And in the darkness of the hold, the lead solder in the tins continued to leach. The officers noticed that the men were becoming strange. Arguments broke out over nothing. Insubordination, usually unheard of in the Royal Navy, began to whisper in the corners. Men forgot orders. They stared blankly at the walls. The poison was attacking their minds. It was stripping away the discipline that held them together. And then, in the depths of that second winter, the unthinkable happened. The leader fell. Sir John Franklin, the father figure, the man who had promised to guide them home, took to his bed.
Spring returned to the Arctic in 1847, but hope did not.
The sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating a world that remained stubbornly, terrifyingly frozen. The ice around the Erebus and Terror had not shifted. It had thickened. The pressure ridges had grown higher, piling up around the hulls like the walls of a fortress, locking them in a grip of white granite. And inside the captain's cabin of the Erebus, the heart of the expedition was failing. On June 11th, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. History does not record the exact cause. There are no medical journals left to tell us if it was pneumonia, a stroke, or simply the exhaustion of an old man whose body could no longer fight the cold. But the psychological blow to the crew was catastrophic. Franklin was more than a commander. He was a celebrity, a symbol of the Royal Navy's invincibility, and a deeply religious father figure to the 128 men under his care. He was the link to England. He was the man who had promised to guide them through. Now he was a corpse. There is no grave for Franklin, no stone marker like those on Beachy Island. The ships were drifting miles from the shore of King William Island. To dig a grave on land would have required dragging his body over miles of treacherous, jagged ice. Most historians believe he was committed to the deep. The crew likely cut a hole through the ice, a dark, square portal into the black water below. Imagine the scene. 128 men, standing on the frozen ocean, their breath rising in plumes of steam, the wind whipping their coats, the chaplain reading the service for the burial of the dead at sea. We therefore commit his body to the deep. And then the splash, the slide of the canvased, wrapped body slipping beneath the ice, descending into the freezing dark to rest on the ocean floor, miles from home and miles from help. The hole was allowed to freeze over. The ice sealed the tomb, and the men were left alone. Command of the expedition now fell to Captain Francis Crozier, the captain of the Terror. If Franklin was the optimist, Crozier was the realist. He was Irish, a man of immense skill and experience, having sailed to both the Arctic and Antarctic with the legendary James Clark Ross. But he was also a melancholic man, unhappily in love with Franklin's niece back home, and deeply cynical about the Navy's hubris. He looked at the ice and he knew. He knew what the others refused to admit. The summer of 1847 was cold, too cold. July came and went. August arrived. In a normal year, the temperatures should have risen. The pack ice should have fractured, creating leads or channels of open water that the ships could steam through. But in 1847, the melt never came. The crew watched from the decks, day after desperate day. They saw puddles form on the surface of the ice, gleaming blue in the sunlight, but the massive blocks, the ones pinning the ships, did not move. It was the lost summer. The realization settled over the ships like a suffocating blanket. They were not going anywhere. They were facing a third winter in the ice. No expedition had ever survived 3 winters without resupply. Their coal was nearly gone. The lemon juice, intended to stop scurvy, had lost its potency after 3 years in casks. The salted meat was becoming tough and rancid, and the tinned food, the lead-laced poison, was now their primary source of sustenance. Crozier ordered the rations cut. The men, already weakened by the toxic food and the damp cold, began to lose weight. Their gums began to bleed. The first signs of scurvy were appearing, the old scars on their bodies opening up, their legs swelling. But worse than the physical decay was the silence. The Royal Arctic Theatre was closed. The hand organ stopped playing. The hope of the Northwest Passage was gone. Now the only goal was survival.
Before Franklin died, back in May of 1847, a small sledge party had been sent out to King William Island. Led by Lieutenant Graham Gore, they trudged across the ice to leave a record of their progress. They built a cairn of stones at a place called Victory Point. Inside, they placed a standard Admiralty canister, a metal cylinder containing a pre-printed form. On the paper, Gore wrote a message. At the time, it was full of confidence. May 1847. Her Majesty's ships Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice. All well. All well. Those two words haunt the history of the expedition. Because when Gore wrote them, the sun was shining. Franklin was still alive. They believed the ice would open in a few months. They sealed the canister, hid it in the rocks, and trekked back to the ships, totally unaware that they were returning to a tomb. Now, months later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon again, signalling the start of the third long night, Crozier looked at his charts. He knew that all well was a lie. The ships were drifting south with the pack, slowly, agonizingly dragging them towards a rocky, desolate coast. The Erebus and Terror were no longer shelters. They were becoming coffins. The steam engines were cold. The heating systems were failing as the coal ran out. The walls were covered in sheets of ice. Crozier made a decision that went against every instinct of a Royal Navy captain. He realized that the ships would never sail again. If they stayed on board, they would die. Their only chance, their slim, terrifying chance, was to walk. They would have to abandon the ships. They would have to drag heavy wooden lifeboats loaded with supplies across hundreds of miles of frozen hell to reach the nearest outpost of civilization in Canada. It was a suicide mission, but staying was a death sentence. But first, they had to survive one last winter. The winter of 1847-48. The winter where the last of the food ran out, and the madness truly began.
The winter of 1847 bled into the spring of 1848. But inside the Erebus and Terror, time had lost its meaning. There was no longer a division between day and night. There was only the cold. The coal reserves, intended to last for 3 years, were effectively gone. The steam engines sat silent, great blocks of freezing iron in the belly of the ship. The hot water pipes that had once kept the sailors warm were now filled with ice. To survive, the men dismantled the interior of their own ships. They tore down the mahogany writing desks, the stage of the Royal Arctic Theatre, and the spare spars. They burnt them in small stoves just to keep the temperature above freezing. But it wasn't enough. The condensation that had plagued them in the first winter now turned into a tomb-like frost. The walls of the cabins were coated in sheets of ice. The men slept in sleeping bags that were frozen stiff. When they woke, they had to crack the ice off their blankets just to move. And then the sickness took hold. Scurvy is a horrific way to die. It doesn't just kill you, it unmakes you. The collagen in your body breaks down. Old wounds, scars from childhood, cuts from years ago suddenly break open and bleed again. It is as if your body is forgetting how to hold itself together. The men's gums swelled until they looked like black sponges. Their teeth loosened. Their legs turned purple and black. But the doctors, Good Sir and Stanley, were helpless. The lemon juice they had brought, thousands of gallons of it, had been stored for too long. The essential vitamin C had degraded. They were drinking it dutifully, but it was just sour brown water. They were rotting while still alive.
But the physical decay was nothing compared to the disintegration of the mind. By this third winter, the lead poisoning had reached a critical mass. The neurotoxin had been accumulating in their brains for 3 years. The symptoms of severe lead poisoning are subtle and terrifying. Paranoia, confusion, aggression, and a strange fixation on trivial things. Captain Crozier ordered the men to prepare the lifeboats for a journey. They were going to drag these massive, heavy boats, weighing nearly a ton each, across the jagged ice to the mainland. Logic dictates that you travel light. You pack food. You pack ammunition. You pack warm clothes. You leave everything else behind. But the men of the Franklin expedition did not do that. When archaeologists and explorers later found the remains of their sledges, they were baffled by what they saw. The men had packed heavy sterling silver cutlery, engraved with the officers' crests. They packed crystal decanters. They packed silk handkerchiefs. They packed a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield. They packed button polish and curtain rods. Why? Why would starving, dying men drag thousands of pounds of useless silver across the ice? Some historians believe it was the lead poisoning, destroying their ability to prioritize. Others believe it was a desperate psychological defense mechanism. They were Royal Navy sailors. They were civilized men. To leave the silver behind, to leave the books behind, was to admit that they were no longer a part of the civilized world. They were clinging to these objects, as if the silver forks could protect them from the savage reality of the ice. They were packing for a picnic when they should have been packing for a war against nature. On April 22nd, 1848, Good Friday, the sun shone brightly on the ice. It was time. Captain Crozier gave the final order. The ships were to be abandoned. Imagine the moment. For 3 years, the Erebus and Terror had been their only home, their only source of heat, food, and safety. To step off the deck onto the ice was to sever the last tie to England. They knew they were not coming back. The 105 surviving men, gaunt, shuffling, ghosts of the strong sailors who had left London, gathered on the ice. They loaded the sledges. The heavy wooden boats sat on iron runners, loaded down with their food, their guns, and their useless silver. They took one last look at the ships. The Erebus and Terror sat dark and silent, tilted by the pressure ridges, looking like dead whales stranded on a white beach. They turned their backs. They put the ropes over their shoulders and they began to pull. Their plan was to march south toward the Great Fish River, hundreds of miles away. They believed they could hunt. They believed they could walk to safety. But they had no idea how weak they really were. Within the first few miles, they stopped at Victory Point on King William Island. They dug up the cairn left by Lieutenant Gore the previous year. They took out the metal canister. They took out the piece of paper that said, "All well." And in the margins, in frantic, scribbled handwriting, Crozier and his second-in-command, Captain Fitzjames, wrote the truth. It is one of the most famous and chilling documents in history. April 25th, 1848. HM ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd April, having been beset since 12th September 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier, start on tomorrow, 26th, for the Back's Fish River. And then the final line, a postscript that sealed the tragedy. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th June 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. They sealed the canister, they buried it in the stones, and then they walked into the white void.
The plan was simple, on paper. Captain Crozier had calculated the distance from Victory Point on King William Island to the Great Fish River on the Canadian mainland was roughly 250 miles. If they could maintain a steady pace, perhaps 10 miles a day, they could reach the river mouth before the ice broke up. From there, they would row upriver to a trading post. It was a desperate plan, but a logical one. But the Arctic does not care for logic. The moment the men put the ropes over their shoulders and leaned into the harness, the reality of their situation crushed them. The sledges were essentially massive oak whaleboats, mounted on heavy iron runners. Fully loaded with provisions, tents, ammunition, and the strange hoard of silver and books, each boat weighed nearly 3,000 pounds. There were no dogs, no horses, only men. Sick, starving, lead-poisoned men. To move one boat, it took 15 or 20 men hauling on drag ropes. They would lean forward, digging their boots into the snow, straining until their muscles screamed. And the ice was not a flat skating rink. It was a chaotic field of pressure ridges, jagged walls of ice that rose up 10 or 20 feet. To cross a ridge, the men had to unload the boat, carry every crate, every tent, every silver fork by hand over the obstacle, then lift the heavy boat over, then reload it, then drag it a few hundred yards, then do it all again at the next ridge. It was agonizing. It was slow. On a good day, they might cover 2 or 3 miles, but usually it was less than 1. They were burning thousands of calories a day in the freezing cold, but their rations provided only a fraction of that. They were effectively eating themselves alive. Their bodies began to consume their own muscle tissue for energy. And the cold was relentless. Even in April, the temperature hovered well below freezing. The wind cut through their ragged navy uniforms, and their sweat froze inside their clothes, turning their shirts into icy armor that chafed their skin raw.
As the days blurred into weeks, the discipline of the Royal Navy began to unravel under the weight of the ropes. Snow blindness became a plague. The glare of the sun on the endless white ice burned the retinas of the men. Their eyes swelled shut, streaming with tears that froze on their cheeks. Blind men, stumbling in the harness, holding on to the shoulder of the man in front of them, just trying to keep walking. And the scurvy returned with a vengeance. Men would be walking in the line, pulling the rope, and suddenly they would just collapse. Their legs would give out, not from exhaustion, but because their joints were filling with blood. When a man fell, the column would stop. The officers would try to rouse him. "Get up," they would say. "We have to keep moving." But some men simply couldn't. This presented a horrific dilemma for Captain Crozier. They couldn't carry the sick. The sledges were already too heavy. There was no room in the boats. If a man couldn't walk, he was left behind. We don't know exactly when the first man was abandoned on the ice, but we know it happened. Archaeologists have found trails of artifacts discarded along the route: buttons, canteens, uniforms, and graves. Shallow, hasty graves scratched into the gravel of the shoreline. The expedition was shedding weight, but they weren't shedding the silver. They weren't shedding the books. They were shedding people. The old well of the Victory Point note was now a distant memory. They were a column of ghosts dragging their own coffins south.
By May, the expedition had reached the southern coast of King William Island, but the ice in the strait leading to the main land was still rough, and the progress was agonizingly slow. Crozier realized the math wasn't working. At this pace, they would run out of food long before they reached the river. He made a fateful decision: a split. He realized that the sick and the weak were slowing down the strong, so he likely ordered a separation. The strongest men, those who could still pull, would continue south toward the river. The sick, the injured, and those too weak to walk would be sent back toward the ships. It was a death sentence disguised as hope. "Go back to the ships," he might have said. "There is still some food there. Wait for us to bring help." But everyone knew the truth. There was no help coming. A large group of men turned around. They began the slow, shuffling march back north, retracing their steps toward the Erebus and Terror. They never made it. Years later, searchers would find their remains scattered along the coastline. Some died in their tents, some died walking. But one discovery, made by the explorer Francis McClintock in 1859, paints the most haunting picture of this return journey. He found a lifeboat mounted on a sledge, but it wasn't pointing south toward safety. It was pointing north, back toward the ships. Inside the boat were two human skeletons. One lay in the bow, one in the stern. And around them was the madness of the Franklin expedition. The boat was filled with 40 pounds of chocolate, several watches, a pair of slippers, fragrant soaps, toothbrushes, and nearly indestructible amounts of sterling silver cutlery. These men had died huddled in a boat in the middle of a frozen desert, surrounded by luxury, but starving to death. They had dragged the symbols of their civilization until the very moment their hearts stopped beating. And as the wind howled over their bones, the silver forks rattled in the dark.
While the men of the Erebus and Terror struggled south, dragging their iron chains and silver plate, they were not alone in the Arctic. For thousands of years, the Inuit had lived on these islands. They were masters of the ice. They knew how to hunt the seal, how to build shelters that defied the wind, and how to navigate the white void without a compass. To the British, the Arctic was a hellscape of death. To the Inuit, it was home. And in the spring of 1848, Inuit families hunting on the southern coast of King William Island saw something that defied explanation. They saw a column of strange figures moving slowly across the ice. They looked like spirits or kalunat, white men, but they did not move like men. They shuffled, they stumbled, they dragged massive wooden beasts behind them on ropes. Oral histories passed down through generations of Inuit elders, describe this encounter with haunting clarity. The Inuit watched from a distance at first. They saw men who were thin, incredibly thin. Their faces were black with frostbite and scurvy. Their mouths were dry and hard. They made strange, croaking sounds when they tried to speak. These were the elite sailors of the Royal Navy, reduced to spectres. The Inuit saw the officers, still wearing their blue coats with gold buttons, trying to maintain order. But the men behind them were in rags. Some were blind, some were crawling. It was a collision of two worlds. One world adapted perfectly to the environment, watching another world, technologically advanced but utterly helpless, dying in slow motion. The Inuit called the leader Agluca. It means the strider, or he who takes long steps. Historians are almost certain this was Captain Francis Crozier. Even in his weakened state, Crozier was trying to project strength, trying to lead his men to safety. But strength was running out.
The meeting between Agluca and the Inuit families is one of the great tragedies of the expedition. The Inuit were wary, but they were not hostile. They saw that these strangers were starving. They approached the camp, bringing seal meat. Crozier, desperate, tried to communicate. He used sign language. He pointed to his mouth. He pointed south, toward the Great Fish River. He was asking for help. He was asking for food. But there was a terrible math at play. The Inuit were a small family group. They hunted enough to feed themselves and their dogs. They lived on the edge of survival every day. Before them stood dozens, perhaps nearly 100 starving men. The Inuit realized quickly that they could not save them. If they gave all their meat to the Kalyanet, the white men would still be hungry, and the Inuit families would starve. The scale of the disaster was too big. The oral histories say that the meeting was tense but sad. The British men were eager, frantic for the seal meat. They traded knives and perhaps some of that useless silver for a few scraps of fat. But it wasn't enough. One account says that the Inuit camped nearby for a night, but the sounds coming from the British camp were terrifying. The groans of the dying, the strange, frantic behavior of the lead-poisoned men. The Inuit realized that these men were doomed, and they feared that the sickness might jump to them. So quietly, in the middle of the night, the Inuit families packed up their sleds and they vanished back into the snow. When the sun rose, the British were alone again. Crozier must have watched them go with a sinking heart. The only people who knew how to survive in this landscape had just walked away. The lifeline was cut. After the Inuit left, the discipline of the column finally broke. They had reached a place that would later be known as Starvation Cove. It is a bleak, rocky inlet on the Adelaide Peninsula, just across the strait from King William Island. They had made it to the mainland, but they were still hundreds of miles from the nearest trading post. The food from the ships was gone. The seal meat from the Inuit was gone. There were no birds to shoot, no caribou to hunt. The men sat in the snow, huddled in their canvas tents. The cold was seeping into their marrow, but the hunger was a living thing inside them. Starvation is a process. First, the body burns its fat. Then it burns its muscle. The heart weakens. The mind hallucinates. But the human drive to survive is stronger than reason. It is primal. It overrides culture. It overrides morality. It overrides the king's regulations. As the men died, one by one,
the survivors looked at the bodies. They were friends. They were messmates. They had served together for 3 years. They had laughed in the theater together. But now they were meat. In the final dark days of the expedition, the last taboo was broken. When archaeologists examined the bones found at Starvation Cove in the 1990s, they found the evidence that the Victorian world had refused to believe for a century. They found cut marks, precise knife marks on the thigh bones, on the arm bones. The Royal Navy, the pride of the Empire, had not just died, they had consumed each other. Agluca's men had become ghouls. We do not know who was the first to suggest it. We do not know if they wept while they did it. We only know that in the end, the unsinkable civilization they brought with them was stripped away entirely, leaving only the ice and the hunger.
While the men of the Erebus and Terror were dying on the ice, the world back home knew nothing. In London, the gas lamps flickered in the drawing rooms. The tea was poured. The newspapers reported on politics and the railways and the empire. But of the 2 ships that had sailed into the white mist in 1845, there was only silence. Silence is a terrifying thing for those who wait. At first, the silence was expected. Franklin had been provisioned for 3 years. No one expected him to send a letter from the top of the world. The plan was for him to emerge in the Pacific, triumphant. But as 1847 turned to 1848, a subtle anxiety began to take hold in the Admiralty. The man most attuned to this silence was not an admiral. It was a woman, Lady Jane Franklin. She was the wife of Sir John, a woman of immense intelligence, will, and political savvy. She sat in her home in London watching the calendar. She knew her husband, she knew the risks, and she knew that the Admiralty, bloated with confidence, would be slow to act. She began to write letters, hundreds of them. She wrote to the Lords of the Admiralty. She wrote to the Prime Minister. She wrote to the Tsar of Russia and the President of the United States. "My husband is missing," she insisted. "We must go find him." The Admiralty hesitated. They argued that Franklin was the most experienced explorer alive, that his ships were invincible, that to send a rescue mission so soon would be an insult to his competence. "They have food for 5 years," the Lords said, repeating the lie that the tin cans had promised. But Lady Jane did not wear black. She refused to put on the widow's weeds. She wore bright colors, a defiant symbol that she believed John was still alive. She wove a tapestry of guilt around the British government. She made the search for Franklin a matter of national honor. If England abandoned its greatest hero in the ice, what did that say about the Empire? Under her pressure, the machine finally woke up. In 1848, the first search ships were sent out. They found nothing, just the endless shifting ice. The panic set in. The government offered a reward, £20,000, a fortune in those days, to anyone who could bring news of the expedition. Suddenly, the Arctic wasn't just a frozen wasteland, it was a treasure hunt.
By 1850, the search had become a frenzy. Ships from Britain and America flooded the Arctic waters. They scoured the coastlines, looking for cairns, for flagpoles, for anything that broke the white horizon. And finally, in August of 1850, they found the first crumb. A search squadron landed on a bleak, gravelly spit of land, Beachy Island. It was the site of Franklin's first winter camp from 1845, the place where they had performed the Royal Arctic Theatre. The searchers walked through the ruins of the camp. They found the remains of the shooting range. They found empty tin cans, hundreds of them, rusted and tossed aside.
They found scraps of newspaper and the finger of a glove. But then they saw the mounds. 3 wooden headboards rising out of the grey gravel, silhouetted against the blinding snow. John Torrington, John Hartnell, William Brain. The searchers stood in silence before the graves. It was a shock. They had hoped to find a message saying, "All is well." Instead, they found a cemetery. The dates on the headboards told a confusing story. These men had died in the first winter, early in 1846, before the ships had vanished. But where had the living gone? The searchers scoured the island for a note. It was standard procedure for the Royal Navy to leave a record in a cairn before moving on, a metal cylinder explaining where they were going next. They turned over every stone. They dug into the frozen earth. They found nothing. Franklin had left no message. He had wintered there, buried 3 men, and then sailed away into the mist without leaving a forwarding address. It was a baffling mystery. Why would a disciplined commander leave no record? Had they left in a hurry? Had they simply forgotten? The 3 graves on Beachy Island became the most famous image of the mystery. They proved that the expedition had been there. They proved that men had died, but they offered no clues to the fate of the other 126 souls.
With no note to guide them, the searchers were blind. The Arctic is vast. It is a labyrinth of thousands of islands, inlets and straits. To look for 2 ships in that expanse, without a direction, is harder than finding a needle in a haystack. It is like finding a needle in a frozen ocean. Lady Jane Franklin, desperate for answers, turned to the supernatural. It sounds strange to us today, but the Victorians were obsessed with spiritualism. Science had failed to find her husband, so she turned to the ghosts. She consulted clairvoyants. She held séances in her London drawing room. A famous medium, the girl with the golden hair, claimed to have a vision. She saw Franklin, alive, trapped in the ice, waiting for help. Another psychic sketched a map, supposedly channeled from the spirit world, showing the ships located in a specific inlet. Lady Jane actually gave these maps to the seasoned sea captains heading north. "Look here," she would say, "the spirits say he is here." And the captains, hardened men of the sea, took them. They were desperate too. They sailed to the coordinates whispered by ghosts, only to find empty bays and cold rocks. The silence of the world was deafening. While the search parties were looking in the wrong places, hundreds of miles to the south, the last survivors of the Franklin expedition were likely already dead. Their bones were bleaching on the shores of King William Island. Their journals, the only record of their suffering, were buried in the snow, rotting away. The world was looking for heroes. They were looking for ships. They were not ready for the truth. But the truth was coming. It wasn't coming from a clairvoyant, and it wasn't coming from the Royal Navy. It was coming from a man who walked on snowshoes, a doctor who listened to the people who actually lived there. Dr. John Ray was about to walk out of the mist with a story so horrific that the Victorian world would try to destroy him for telling it.
While the Royal Navy smashed its massive wooden ships against the ice, hunting for Franklin with brute force, a different kind of man was walking quietly across the tundra. His name was Dr. John Ray. He was not a Navy man. He was a surgeon for the Hudson's Bay Company. He didn't command a floating fortress. He didn't carry silver cutlery or crystal decanters. Ray was a scandal to the Victorian elite because he had gone native. He wore Inuit furs instead of wool uniforms. He walked on snowshoes. He slept in igloos. He travelled light, hunting caribou and hare as he went. He understood what Franklin and Crozier did not. To survive the Arctic, you cannot fight it. You must become part of it. In the spring of 1854, 6 years after the Erebus and Terror had been abandoned, Ray was surveying the Boothia Peninsula, hundreds of miles south of where the Navy was searching. He wasn't looking for Franklin. He was just doing his job, mapping the coast. But on April 21st, he met an Inuit hunter named Inukpuzejang. The man had a strange object on his person, a gold cap band, the kind worn by a British naval officer. Ray stopped cold. He asked where he had gotten it. The hunter told him a story that he had heard from others, a story of a large party of white men, Kablunas, who had died of starvation a few years earlier near the mouth of the Great Fish River. Ray knew instantly what this meant. The mystery was over. Franklin's men hadn't sailed to the Pacific. They hadn't been trapped in an open polar sea. They had died, walking south. Ray spent the next few days trading with the local Inuit families. He bought everything they had found. The items that spilled out of their sealskin bags were heartbreakingly familiar. A silver fork with the crest of Sir John Franklin, a medal belonging to Captain Crozier, a watch belonging to Graham Gore. These were the talismans of the lost expedition. The silver they had dragged until they dropped. Now it was currency in the Arctic, traded for needles and knives. But the relics were not the only thing the Inuit offered. They offered the truth. And the truth was uglier than anything John Ray was prepared to hear.
The Inuit elders told Ray about the final days of the white men. They described finding a camp at a place now called Starvation Cove. They found roughly 30 bodies. Some were in tents, some were buried under their overturned boat. They described the men as being incredibly thin, gaunt, their mouths black and dry. But then the Inuit lowered their voices. They told Ray what they had seen in the camp. They had found kettles, the metal pots the sailors used for cooking, and inside the kettles they found boiled human flesh. They found bones that had been cracked open to extract the marrow. They found bodies that had been stripped of muscle. The implication was clear. In their final, maddened desperation, the officers and gentlemen of the Royal Navy had resorted to the last taboo, cannibalism. John Ray was a doctor. He was a man of science. He knew what starvation did to the human mind. He didn't judge the dead. He simply recorded the testimony. He wrote it down in his report to the Admiralty. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't use euphemisms. From the mutilated state of many of the corpses and the contents of the kettles, he wrote, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last resource, cannibalism, as a means of prolonging existence. He packed up the silver forks, the watches and the medals, and he walked back to civilization. He thought he was bringing closure. He thought he would be hailed as a hero for solving the greatest mystery of the age. He was wrong.
When John Ray's report reached London in October 1854, it didn't just cause a stir, it caused a riot of indignation. The Victorian public could accept that their heroes had died, they could accept that they had frozen, they could even accept that they had failed. But they could not accept that British sailors, Christian men, officers of the Queen, would eat each other. It went against everything the Empire stood for.
The British were civilized. Savages ate people. British explorers did not. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Lady Jane Franklin, horrified by the stain on her husband's legacy, launched a smear campaign against Ray. She enlisted the help of the most famous writer in the world, Charles Dickens. Dickens wrote a furious article in his magazine, Household Words. He attacked Ray's credibility. He argued that the Inuit were liars, covetous, treacherous, and cruel. Dickens spun a new theory, one that fit the Victorian worldview. He suggested that the Inuit had murdered the weakened sailors, and they were the ones who had mutilated the bodies. No British seaman, Dickens thundered, would ever succumb to such barbarism. The public believed Dickens. They wanted to believe him. It was a comforting lie. John Ray, the man who had found the truth, was shunned. He was the only major explorer of his time not to be knighted. He was treated as a pariah because he refused to edit the horror out of history. The Admiralty paid him the reward money, but they did it quietly. They wanted him to go away. They closed the file. They declared Franklin a hero who died discovering the passage. They built statues of him in London. But the silver forks sat in the museum cases, silent witnesses. And far to the north, under the snow of King William Island, the cracked bones of the crew lay waiting. It would take another 140 years and the invention of modern forensics before the world would finally apologize to John Ray. But in 1854, the door was slammed shut on the truth. The ghosts of the Erebus and Terror were sanitized. They became marble statues, pure and white as the ice that killed them. But the story wasn't over, because while Ray had found the end, no one had found the beginning. No one had found the ships. The Erebus and Terror were still out there, hidden in the deep, waiting for someone to look in the right place.
For over a century, the Arctic kept its secrets. After John Ray was silenced and the statues of Franklin were polished in London, the snow continued to fall on King William Island. The bones of the men who had walked away from the ships lay scattered in the gravel, bleached white by the endless summer suns and buried deep by the winter blizzards. Explorers came and went. Francis McClintock in 1859 found the lifeboat and the Victory Point note. American explorer Frederick Schwatka in 1879 found graves and listened to more Inuit stories. But the why remained elusive. Why had 1,229 men, equipped with the best technology of the Victorian age, died so completely? Why had they dropped dead in their tracks while hauling silver? Why had they gone mad? The answer didn't come until 1981. Enter Dr. Owen Beatty, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Alberta. He wasn't looking for ships. He wasn't looking for treasure. He was looking for biology. He wanted to talk to the men themselves, or what was left of them. Beatty led a team to the southern coast of King William Island, to the same bleak, wind-swept gravel that Agluca's men had trudged across 138 years earlier. The landscape hadn't changed. It was still a lunar wasteland of grey stones and ice. Beatty's team began to comb the ground. It didn't take long. They found a human cranium staring up from the moss, then a femur, then fragments of a rib cage. These were the remains of a single sailor, a man aged roughly 20 to 25. His identity was lost, but his bones were a library of information. Beatty treated this unknown sailor not as a historical footnote, but as a crime scene victim.
He collected the bones with the precision of a detective. He took them back to the lab, and under the microscope, the Victorian hero myth finally crumbled, replacing romance with hard, cold data.
The first thing the bones revealed was the scurvy. The surface of the bone was pitted and rough, like pumice stone. This was evidence of severe chronic vitamin C deficiency. The sailor's body had been cannibalizing its own skeleton to survive. It confirmed that the lemon juice, the cure the Navy trusted, had been useless. But then, Beatty looked closer at the chemical composition of the bone. He sent a small sample of hair, found preserved in the frozen mud, and fragments of bone to a laboratory for trace element analysis. He was looking for heavy metals. When the results came back, they were off the charts. A normal human being might have a lead level of 5 parts per million in their hair, maybe slightly higher if they live in a polluted city. The sailor from King William Island had lead levels of 228 parts per million. It was a staggering, lethal dose. This was the smoking gun. It proved that the men weren't just starving. They were being poisoned. The lead was attacking their central nervous systems, causing the paranoia, the lethargy, and the madness that explained the silver cutlery and the strange decisions. But then, Beatty looked closer at the chemical composition of the bone. He sent a small sample of hair, found preserved in the frozen mud, and fragments of bone to a laboratory for trace element analysis. He was looking for heavy metals. When the results came back, they were off the charts. A normal human being might have a lead level of 5 parts per million in their hair, maybe slightly higher if they live in a polluted city. The sailor from King William Island had lead levels of 228 parts per million. It was a staggering, lethal dose. This was the smoking gun. It proved that the men weren't just starving. They were being poisoned. The lead was attacking their central nervous systems, causing the paranoia, the lethargy, and the madness that explained the silver cutlery and the strange decisions. But Beatty found something else, something that vindicated John Ray after a century of shame. On the leg bones of the unknown sailor, Beatty found clusters of fine parallel scratches. They were not made by animal teeth. Wolves gnaw and crush. These marks were precise. They were linear. They were cut marks made by a steel blade. The location of the cuts was consistent with defleshing, the removal of large muscle groups for consumption. Here, under the fluorescent lights of a modern lab, was the undeniable proof. The Inuit had told the truth. Dickens had been wrong. The men of the Franklin expedition, poisoned and starving, had indeed turned to the dead to sustain the living.
The discovery on King William Island was a breakthrough. It proved the lead poisoning theory. It proved the cannibalism. But Dr. Beatty wasn't satisfied. The bones on King William Island had been exposed to the elements for over a century. They were weathered. The data they provided was powerful, but it was dry data. Beatty realized that to truly understand the health of the crew, to know exactly when the poisoning started and how it affected them, he needed better samples. He needed soft tissue. He needed organs. He needed a body that hadn't turned to dust. His mind turned north, back to the beginning, back to the first winter camp, Beachy Island. He thought of the 3 lonely wooden headboards standing in the gravel: John Torrington, John Hartnell, William Brain. These men had died in January and April of 1846. They had been buried deep in the permafrost, inside wooden coffins. The permafrost acts as a time capsule. If the ground never thawed, then the bodies inside those coffins wouldn't be skeletons. They would be perfectly preserved. Beatty devised a plan that was both scientifically necessary and deeply haunting. He would travel to Beachy Island. He would dig up the graves, and he would look into the faces of the men who died before the nightmare truly began. He wanted to see if the lead poisoning was already in their systems during that first comfortable winter. In the summer of 1984, Beatty and his team landed on Beachy. The wind was howling. The 3 wooden markers were weathered grey by the salt spray. They set up their camp. They picked up their shovels, and they began to chip away at the frozen earth. They were about to wake the dead.
August 1984. Dr. Owen Beatty and his small team stood on the shore of Beachy Island. The wind was cutting, the sky a flat, oppressive grey. Before them lay the grave of John Torrington, the first man to die. Digging a grave in the Arctic is hard. Exhuming one is nearly impossible. The ground was a solid block of permafrost, gravel and ice cemented together like concrete. The archaeologists couldn't just shovel it away. They had to chip at it, slowly, carefully. They worked for days. They used buckets of warm water, heated on camp stoves, to gently melt the permafrost around the coffin. The water turned the grey clay into a slurry, which they scooped out by hand. It was slow, intimate work. They were stripping away the blanket of the earth, inch by inch. Finally, the shovel hit wood. It was a sound that hadn't been heard in 138 years, the hollow thud of a coffin lid. They cleared the mud away. The wood was mahogany, beautifully preserved by the cold. On the lid, a simple tin plaque shone dully in the Arctic light. John Torrington died January 1st, 1846, aged 20 years. The team paused. This was the moment of truth. If the coffin had leaked, if the ground had thawed and refrozen over the centuries, the body inside would be nothing but bones and rags. But if the seal held, if the ice had done its work, Beatty reached down. He removed the nails, which came away easily, uncorroded by time. He lifted the lid. Inside, there was a block of solid ice. The coffin had filled with water at some point and then frozen solid. Encased within that block was a shape, a shroud. They poured more warm water. They melted the ice around the head. And then John Torrington looked back at them.
It is one of the most famous and haunting images in the history of exploration. John Torrington did not look dead. He looked patient. His face was not a skull, it was a face. His skin was a pale, milky yellow, but perfectly intact. His eyes were open, staring up at the Arctic sky with a startling icy blue intensity. His nose was thin, his teeth, slightly bared, were white. Someone, a friend, a shipmate, had tied a blue patterned handkerchief around his head to keep his jaw closed, but the knot had slipped, leaving his mouth slightly ajar. It gave him an expression of surprise, or perhaps a silent gasp. He looked like a man who had held his breath for a century. The team was stunned. They were looking at a Victorian sailor, a young man who had walked the decks of the Terror, who had laughed in the theatre, who had eaten the soup. He was so well preserved that they could see the calluses on his hands. They could see the stubble on his chin. But he was also terribly thin. He weighed only 88 pounds. He was emaciated. Beatty and his team had to perform the autopsy right there, on the frozen beach. They couldn't move him. They thawed the body completely. They undressed him. Underneath his wool shirt, his ribs protruded sharply against his skin. They took samples, tissue from the lungs, bones, hair, fingernails. It was a somber, quiet procedure. They were invading the rest of a boy who had been buried with love, but they were doing it to find the killer of his 128 friends. As they worked, the wind howled around them, but Torrington, the boy in the ice, lay peaceful, a messenger from the past, finally delivering his testimony.
The autopsy results confirmed the nightmare. John Torrington had died of pneumonia. His lungs were black, filled with carbon deposits. This made sense. He was a stoker. He spent his days shoveling coal into the roaring furnaces of the Terror. He breathed smoke for a living. The pneumonia had filled his lungs with fluid, drowning him on dry land. But that wasn't the whole story. When the toxicology report came back on his hair, the lead levels were high, not as astronomically high as the skeleton found on King William Island, but climbing. Torrington had died only 8 months into the expedition, and yet he already had over 90 parts per million of lead in his system. This was the smoking gun Beatty needed. It proved that the poisoning didn't happen at the end when they were starving and desperate. It was happening at the beginning. The gold standard tinned food, the pride of the Victorian Navy, was slowly killing them from the very first meal. Torrington was sickened by the smoke, weakened by the cold, but his immune system had been compromised by the lead. A healthy 20-year-old might have fought off the pneumonia. A lead-poisoned, malnourished stoker could not. The lead explained why the officers died early. It explained why the men couldn't pull the sledges. It explained the mental fog. The expedition was doomed before it even left London. Beatty and his team carefully redressed John Torrington. They placed him back in his coffin. They wrote a note explaining who they were and what they had done, and placed it inside a plastic tube at his feet. They nailed the lid shut. They covered him with the permafrost, and they left him to sleep. But they weren't done. There were 2 more graves, 2 more witnesses, John Hartnell and William Brain. If Torrington had told them about the lead, Hartnell was about to tell them about the procedure, because when they opened the second coffin, they found that the Victorian doctors had been looking for answers long before Beatty arrived.
After the haunting gaze of John Torrington, Dr. Beatty and his team moved a few yards to the right, to the second headboard. John Hartnell died January 4th, 1846, aged 25 years. Hartnell had died only 3 days after Torrington, 2 deaths in the same week in the first winter. The panic on board the ships must have been palpable. The team repeated the grueling process, melting the permafrost, chipping away the gravel until the wood of the coffin appeared. Hartnell was an able seaman on the Erebus. He was older than Torrington and reportedly stronger. His family back in England remembered him as a young man full of life. And uniquely, he had not been alone. His younger brother, Thomas Hartnell, was also a sailor on the Erebus. Thomas had watched his big brother die. He had likely helped wash the body. He had likely helped carry this very coffin across the ice. When Beatty lifted the lid, the ice block inside was clear. John Hartnell stared back. His eyes were wide open, gazing up at the lid of his coffin with an expression that looked almost like shock. His brown hair was perfectly preserved, spilling out from under a cloth cap that had been pulled down over his ears. His skin was darker than Torrington's, perhaps from the blood pooling, or perhaps just his complexion. But as the team melted the ice around his torso, they noticed something strange about his clothes. John Torrington had been dressed neatly, his shirt buttoned, his limbs straightened. John Hartnell's shirt was cut open. It wasn't torn by age, it had been sliced vertically from the collar down to the stomach. And underneath the shirt, on the frozen yellow skin of his chest, was a long, jagged incision.
The team realized instantly what they were looking at. This wasn't just a burial. This was a medical investigation. In 1846, Harry Goodsere, the surgeon of the Erebus, had performed an autopsy on John Hartnell. This discovery changed the entire narrative of the first winter. It proved that the deaths of Torrington and Hartnell were not treated as routine tragedies. The doctors were alarmed. They didn't understand why healthy young men were dropping dead. Imagine the scene in the sickbay of the Erebus. The ship is locked in ice. The temperature outside is 40 below. Inside, by the light of oil lamps, Dr. Goodsere is leaning over the body of his shipmate. The air is cold, the breath of the doctor misting over the open chest cavity. He cuts through the ribs. He lifts the breastbone. He examines the lungs, the heart, the liver. He is searching for a killer. He is looking for scurvy. He is looking for typhus. But he wouldn't have been able to see the true killer. You cannot see lead poisoning with the naked eye. You cannot see the neurotoxins seeping into the cells. Goodsere likely finished the autopsy frustrated. He found damaged lungs, signs of tuberculosis, but TB shouldn't have killed a man so quickly. In their haste, or perhaps out of respect for the waiting brother, the doctors replaced Hartnell's breastbone upside down. They sewed him back up roughly. They pulled his shirt closed, but didn't button it. They placed a tall hat on his head, perhaps to hide the incision made to check his brain. And then they buried him. Dr. Beatty's modern autopsy confirmed what Goodsere had likely suspected but couldn't prove. John Hartnell had tuberculosis. His body was riddled with it, but like Torrington, his hair told a darker story. Lead levels high. His immune system had been shattered by the metal. The tuberculosis, which might have remained dormant in a healthy man, saw its chance. It flared up and consumed him in a matter of weeks. But there was one final, heartbreaking detail about John Hartnell. When the researchers looked closely at his face, they saw the indentation of a hatband on his forehead, but the hat he was wearing in the coffin didn't match the mark. And beneath him, tucked into the pillow of wood shavings, was a second hat. It seems that Thomas, his brother, didn't want John to be cold. Before the lid was nailed shut, someone, almost certainly Thomas, had placed an extra cap in the coffin, a final gesture of care in a world of ice. Thomas Hartnell would survive this burial. He would survive the second winter and the third. He would walk out onto the ice with Captain Crozier in 1848, and somewhere on the lonely march south, Thomas would fall too. There was no one left to give him an extra hat. Beatty's team closed John Hartnell's coffin. They lowered him back into the permafrost. 2 witnesses had spoken. Both pointed to the same invisible assassin, the tins. But there was one final grave left. William Brain, the man who died in April, just as the sun was returning. If Torrington and Hartnell were tragic, William Brain was a horror story, because when they opened his coffin, they realized that his burial had not been gentle. The expedition was unraveling, and William Brain's body was the proof.
The team moved to the third and final grave. William Brain died April 3rd, 1846, aged 32 years. Brain had died 3 months after the others. Spring had technically arrived. The sun was back. The crew should have been hopeful, preparing for the ice to melt. But Brain's burial suggests that by April, the mood on the Erebus had shifted from tragedy to exhaustion. When Dr. Beachy lifted the lid of William Brain's coffin, the sight was strikingly different from the peaceful slumber of John Torrington. Brain did not look like he was sleeping. He looked like he had fought a battle. His body was not pristine. It was covered in a layer of decomposition that the others lacked. His skin was dark, shriveled, and separated in places. The smell, locked away for nearly 140 years, was potent and foul. But it was his posture that sent a chill through the archaeologists. Torrington and Hartnell had been laid out with care, hands crossed over their chests, heads resting on pillows of wood shavings. William Brain looked like he had been tossed in. His left arm was not crossed. It was crumpled underneath his body, bent at an awkward, painful angle. It was as if the rigor mortis had set in, and the men burying him hadn't bothered to straighten his limbs. They had simply forced him into the box. His mouth was open in a rictus grimace, his teeth bared in a snarl that time hadn't softened. And then they noticed his shirt. It was a standard issue striped cotton shirt, but on William Brain it didn't fit right. The collar was tight against his throat. The sleeves were twisted. When they examined it closely, they realized why. The shirt had been put on backwards.
The sloppy dressing of William Brain spoke volumes. In the Victorian Navy, the burial of a shipmate was a sacred duty. You washed him, you dressed him in his best clothes, you treated the body with the utmost dignity. But by April 1846, that dignity was slipping. Whoever dressed Brain was tired, or sick, or perhaps afraid. They had hurried. They had shoved his stiffening arms into the sleeves without checking the front or back. They had jammed him into the coffin with his arm twisted under him and nailed the lid shut as fast as they could. It was the first physical evidence of the breakdown of morale. But there was something else on Brain's face, something that hinted at the conditions inside the ship before he died. On his nose and on his forehead there were small, distinct gnaw marks. They were not made by wolves or foxes after burial. The coffin was sealed tight. They were made by rats. This meant that as William Brain lay dying in the sick bay of the Erebus, too weak to move, too sick to defend himself, rats were running over his face. Or perhaps they had gotten to him in the hours between his death and his discovery. Either way, it painted a horrific picture of the living conditions on board. The floating palace of 1845 had become a pest-infested, disease-ridden trap by 1846. The autopsy results for Brain were the final nail in the coffin of the bad luck theory. Like the others, he had pneumonia. Like the others, he had tuberculosis. And like the others, his lead levels were catastrophic. Brain was a big man, over 6 feet tall.
but in the coffin, he weighed less than 90 pounds. He had wasted away. The lead had poisoned his blood, the scurvy had weakened his flesh, and the rats had gnawed at his remains.
Dr. Beachy and his team reburied William Brain. They replaced the gravel. They left the three men to their eternal watch over the bay. The message from the graves was clear. The expedition was doomed from the start. The lead poisoning explained the physical weakness. It explained the mental confusion. But it didn't explain everything. Lead poisoning makes you sick. It makes you mad. But it doesn't make ships disappear. For decades, the final resting place of the Erebus and Terror remained the ocean's greatest prize. We knew the men had walked away. We knew they had died on King William Island. But the ships themselves, the massive iron-reinforced bomb vessels, they had vanished. Inuit testimony had always said that one ship sank in deep water and the other drifted south, eventually sinking near a place they called Utchulik. For 160 years, searchers ignored the Inuit accounts. They looked further north, where the ships were abandoned. They assumed the ice crushed them right there. They were wrong. It wasn't until the 21st century, when modern search teams finally decided to listen to the oral histories, that the sonar screens pinged. In 2014, in the shallow waters of Queen Maud Gulf, far south of where anyone expected, a shape appeared on the scanner. It wasn't a rock, it wasn't a whale, it was a shipwreck, sitting upright, perfectly preserved. The Erebus had been found, and inside her hull, the water was cold enough to keep secrets for eternity.
September 2014. For 166 years, the HMS Erebus had been a ghost, a legend, a ship that existed only in paintings and the nightmares of historians. But on a calm autumn day, in the shallow waters of Queen Maud Gulf, the ghost became solid iron. A Parks Canada search team, guided by the oral history of the local Inuit, was towing a sonar towfish behind their boat. They were scanning the seabed, looking for anomalies. Suddenly, on the glowing green screen, a shape appeared. It wasn't a rock formation, it wasn't a school of fish. It was unmistakably a ship. There were the straight lines of the deck, the curve of the hull, the debris of the masts lying on the seafloor. The location was shocking. The Erebus was found roughly 60 miles south of where Captain Crozier had abandoned her in 1848. For over a century, the Western world assumed the ice had crushed the ships to splinters near King William Island. But the Inuit had always said, no, one ship sank in deep water, the other drifted south. They said that men were seen on board the drifting ship, that they had remanned it, that they had piloted it south, desperate to find a way out. The discovery of the Erebus proved them right. The ship hadn't just drifted, it had likely been steered. The anchor was deployed. This meant that someone, in the final days of the disaster, had dropped the anchor to stop the ship from drifting onto the rocks. Someone was alive on board, long after the march began.
When the divers went down, they entered a world frozen in time. The Erebus sits in only 11 meters of water. It is so shallow that in winter the sea ice almost scrapes the top of the wreck. The ship is covered in a thick blanket of kelp and algae, waving gently in the current like a shroud. But beneath the green growth, the ship is remarkably intact. The divers found the ship's bronze bell. It was sitting on the deck, dislodged from its mount, but waiting to be found. When they cleaned it off, the date 1845 shone clearly in the underwater light. The symbol of the Royal Navy, the broad arrow, was stamped into the metal. They found cannons. They found the ship's wheel. They found the heavy oak timbers that had been reinforced to fight the ice, now serving as a home for sea anemones and crabs. But the most haunting discoveries were the personal ones. Inside the officers' cabins, they found hairbrushes, they found shoes, they found ceramic plates still stacked in the cupboards. It looked like a house that had been abandoned in a hurry. But it also looked strangely orderly. The Erebus was a tomb, but it was a messy one. The upper deck had collapsed in places. The ice had taken its toll over a century and a half. But if the Erebus was a ruin, the second discovery, 2 years later, was a miracle, because the Terror, the ship of Captain Crozier, didn't just drift, it hid.
September 2016. The search for the second ship was seemingly at a dead end. But then a ranger named Sammy Kogvik told a story to the search team. He said that years earlier, while snowmobiling across the ice of a bay called Terror Bay, he had seen a large wooden pole sticking out of the ice. He thought it looked like a ship's mast. He had taken a picture, but lost his camera. No one believed him. But the search team decided to listen. They diverted their ship to Terror Bay, a place famously ignored by previous searchers because it was too far off course. They dropped the sonar, and there she was, the HMS Terror. If the Erebus was a ghost, the Terror was a time capsule. She was sitting in deeper water, roughly 24 meters down, and she was pristine. The hull was intact, the bowsprit was still pointing forward, the ship sat perfectly upright on the sandy bottom, as if she were ready to sail. But the most chilling detail was the windows. The stern gallery windows, the glass panels in the captain's cabin were unbroken. Think about that. A wooden ship crushed by the Arctic ice for 170 years, and the glass windows were still intact. This meant the ship had sunk gently. It hadn't been crushed. It had likely been closed up by the crew, winterized, and then sank slowly when the water finally breached the hull. The divers looked through the windows with their flashlights. Inside they saw tables. They saw bottles sitting on shelves. They saw rifles hanging on the walls. It was a Mary Celeste of the ice. The discovery of the Terror in Terror Bay changed everything. It was far south of the abandonment point. It proved that the men didn't just walk away and die. Some of them came back. They reopened the ships. They fired up the stoves. They tried to sail out. The long walk wasn't the only ending. There was a second act to the tragedy. An act played out by a skeleton crew returning to their floating prisons, preferring to die in their bunks rather than on the ice. And inside the Terror, locked in the captain's desk, might be the Holy Grail, the journals, the logs, the written history of what happened after the lights went out. We haven't opened the desk yet, but the ship is waiting. We travel back in time now, away from the high-tech sonar of the 21st century to the silence of the 1850s. The Erebus and Terror have been deserted by the main column of walkers, but, as we now know, they were not empty.
Inuit oral history tells us that a group of hunters spotted one of the ships drifting in the ice, far south of the original abandonment point. It was locked in the floe, tilted to one side, a dark wooden mountain rising out of the white. The Inuit were curious. Wood and iron were more valuable than gold in the Arctic. A ship like this was a treasure trove of raw materials. So they approached. They saw a gangplank or a ladder hanging down the side of the hull. This was a clear sign that the ship was still active. Men had lowered it. The hunters climbed up. Imagine the sound of their soft boots on the frozen deck, the wind whistling through the rigging, the complete, unnatural silence of a vessel designed for 100 men, now occupied by shadows. They peered into the darkness of the hatchway. The smell would have been the first thing to hit them. A mix of stale coal smoke, damp rot, and death. They descended into the belly of the ship. It was pitch black inside. The oil lamps had long since burned out. The only light came from the open hatch above. As their eyes adjusted, they realized they were not alone.
The Inuit described finding dead men. But these weren't the neat, bundled bodies of Beachy Island. These were men who had died where they fell. In the cabins, they found bodies in the bunks, men who had curled up under their blankets and simply never woke up. But in the main area, the darkness held a more terrifying sight. The oral history describes a giant man, a man much larger than the others, sitting or lying in the darkness. His skin was black, not from heritage, but from frostbite and decomposition. But the detail that terrified the Inuit hunters was his face. They said the giant man was smiling. His lips had pulled back, revealing long yellow teeth. To the Inuit, this looked like a rictus of amusement, a ghost laughing at its own death. In reality, it was the receding gums of scurvy and the drying of the skin. This giant is often believed to be one of the officers, perhaps even Franklin himself, though he died earlier, or a large man like William Braine. But the image of the smiling dead man in the dark ship became a cautionary tale among the Inuit. The hunters did not stay long in that room. The spirits were too strong. The air was too heavy with sickness. They grabbed what they could, knives, pieces of wood, iron, and they fled the house of the dead. They never returned to the inside of the ship. They feared that the bad spirits that killed the white men would follow them home.
This testimony, recorded by searchers like McClintock and Hall in the mid-19th century, gives us a chilling glimpse into the final days of the remanned ships. It suggests that a small group of men, perhaps 10 or 20, realized the march south was a suicide mission. They turned around. They walked back to the ships. They likely hoped to sail them out, or perhaps they just wanted to die in a bed. They fired up the stoves one last time. They ate the last of the tinned food, and one by one, the lights went out. When the Inuit arrived, the ship had become a mausoleum. But the Inuits did not leave empty-handed. They harvested the wood and iron from the upper decks, and in a strange twist of fate, the artifacts of the Franklin expedition began to scatter across the Arctic. Years later, searchers would find Inuit camps hundreds of miles away, using tools made from the Erebus. They found seal spears tipped with Royal Navy iron. They found knives made from saw blades. They found mahogany wood, once part of a captain's desk,
carved into figurines. The civilization that Franklin brought to the Arctic had failed to conquer it. But the Inuit, masters of adaptation, had absorbed it. They took the useless debris of the empire and turned it into tools for survival. The ship eventually sank, slipping beneath the waves to join its sister, but the story of the smiling man remained, a whisper in the oral history, keeping the memory of the ghost ship alive long after the water had closed over the mast.
In May of 1859, the explorer Francis McClintock was retracing the steps of the lost men. He was walking along a gravel ridge on King William Island, a desolate stretch of stones that the British sailors had crossed 11 years earlier. And there, lying face down in the pebbles, he found him. It was a skeleton. The bones were bleached white, but the man was still dressed. He wore a blue steward's uniform, the double row of buttons still shining in the sun. He had a black silk neckerchief tied around his vertebrae. He had fallen while walking. He had simply pitched forward, too weak to take another step, and died where he lay. But it was what McClintock found in the man's pocket that turned this from a discovery into a ghost story. It was a leather pocketbook, frozen, stiff, and covered in mould. McClintock carefully pried it open. Inside were papers, identity documents, a seaman's certificate. The name on the papers was Harry Peglar. He was the captain of the foretop on the HMS Terror, a leading seaman, a respected man. But the skeleton was not Harry Peglar. The uniform belonged to a steward, likely a man named Thomas Armitage. Why was a steward wearing a uniform that didn't fit him, carrying the identity papers of another man? Were they friends? Had Peglar died and Armitage taken his papers to return them to his family? It was a mystery of identity. But the true horror lay in the other pages of the book.
On the blank pages of the document, the man had tried to write, but the writing was broken. It was a jumble of words, seemingly random. He wrote about the camp of terror. He wrote about the heavy heart. He quoted a line from a sea shanty, and then a line from a funeral hymn. "O death, where is thy sting?" But the terrifying part was the way he wrote. The letters were backward. He spelled the as EHT. He ended sentences in the middle of words. He capitalized random letters. It looked like the writing of a child or a drunkard. But Harry Peglar and Thomas Armitage were literate men. They knew how to read and write. What McClintock had found was a clinical record of a mind disintegrating. Modern neurologists have looked at the Peglar papers. They recognize the symptoms immediately. It is a condition called dysgraphia, the loss of the ability to write coherently. And what causes sudden, severe dysgraphia? Lead poisoning. The heavy metal in the man's blood was attacking the language centers of his brain. He was lying in a tent or stumbling through the snow, trying desperately to record his final thoughts. He knew what he wanted to say, but his hand and his brain refused to cooperate. He was trapped inside a dissolving mind. He wrote the word crozier backward. He wrote the date, but got the year wrong. It is a heartbreaking document, a man trying to leave a message for his family, but finding that he has forgotten how to be human.
The skeleton of the steward, clutching the papers of the seaman, is a symbol of the bond that held the crew together until the end. It suggests that as men died, the survivors carried their memories. They took their combs, their watches, their diaries. "I will take this home for you," they promised. But then the carrier would fall, and someone else would pick up the burden. By the end, the last few survivors must have been carrying the weight of dozens of dead men in their pockets, a heavy, useless archive of tragedy. The Peglar papers end mid-sentence. The handwriting trails off into a scratch. The man likely died moments after writing it, or perhaps he simply lost the will to hold the pencil. He lay there on the gravel ridge, the lead in his veins silencing his voice until the snow covered him. McClintock took the book. He buried the bones. But the image of that backward writing, the looking-glass language of the doomed, remains one of the most chilling proofs of what really happened on the ice. They didn't just starve, they lost themselves. But while individual men were dropping on the ridge, a larger group, the main body of the survivors, was still moving. They were dragging a massive boat toward a place that would become the final, most gruesome scene of the entire disaster. They were heading for a place the Inuit simply called the place where the bones lie.
We are nearing the end of the line. The trail of the dead, which began at the Victory Point cairn and stretched for 80 miles down the coast of King William Island, eventually converged on a single, desolate location. The Inuit call it Kavawawaludli, the place of the roof, or the place where the bones lie. Western maps call it the Erebus Bay boat site, or more generally, the western side of the Adelaide Peninsula. It was here that the main body of the survivors, the roughly 30 or 40 men who had managed to keep walking, finally stopped. They had reached the southern edge of King William Island. Across the strait, less than 20 miles away, was the mainland of Canada, the Great Fish River. Salvation. But nature played one final, cruel trick. It was summer. The sea ice in the strait was rotting. It was candle ice, a slushy, unstable chaos of water and sharp needles. It wasn't solid enough to walk on, but it was too thick to row a boat through. They were trapped. They could see the mainland. They could perhaps even smell the scent of the willow bushes carried on the wind, but they couldn't reach it. So, Agluca, Captain Crozier, gave the order to camp. They pitched their canvas tents on the grey gravel. They pulled the heavy lifeboats up onto the shore to use as windbreaks. And they waited. They waited for the ice to clear. They waited for birds to fly over. They waited for a miracle. But what arrived instead was the end.
The Inuit hunters who found the camp seasons later described a scene of absolute stillness. They found the tents still standing, though tattered by the wind. They approached cautiously, fearing the spirits of the dead. Inside the tents, they found the men. They were not huddled together for warmth. They were lying in their bedrolls, organized, separate. This suggests that even at the very end, the discipline of the Royal Navy held. They had died in their assigned places. But the condition of the bodies told the true story of their final days. The Inuit described black mouths, The men's lips and gums were dried and blackened by scurvy and dehydration. But it was what lay outside the tents that horrified the hunters. Scattered around the campsite were the tools of butchery, not for hunting caribou, but for hunting the fallen. Inuit accounts recorded by explorers like Charles Francis Hall describe finding boots, heavy leather sea boots, but they weren't being used for walking. The Inuit found that the boots had been filled with boiled human flesh. The survivors, lacking pots or kettles large enough, or perhaps having lost them, had used their own footwear as vessels. They had cooked their shipmates in the leather boots, trying to extract the last calories from the meat. It is a detail so gruesome, so surreal, that it haunts the imagination. These men, who had dined on silver platters in the Royal Arctic Theatre, were now eating out of their own shoes.
The field of ghosts represents the collapse of the Victorian mind. We know from the bones found at this site, analysed by modern forensic teams, that the cannibalism here was systematic. It wasn't a frenzy, it was a procedure. The bones show signs of pot polish. This happens when bone ends rub against a metal pot in boiling water for hours. It means they were boiling the bones to make broth, to get the grease. They were trying to survive. They were trying to walk that last 20 miles. But the lead poisoning, the scurvy, and the exhaustion were too much. One by one, the fires went out. The last man likely died alone, surrounded by the silent tents of his friends, listening to the wind rattle the silver forks in the boat. When the Inuit arrived, they saw the wealth of the British Empire scattered on the rocks: watches, telescopes, guns, books. They took what was useful, the wood and iron, but they left the rest. They left the gold watches ticking in the snow. They left the silver. To the Inuit, these things had no value. You cannot eat silver. You cannot build a shelter with a telescope. The objects that the British had died dragging were left to rust, and the sand slowly drifted over the bones, burying the tragedy for 100 years. But there is one final mystery, one final question that hangs over the entire disaster. Where is the leader? We know Franklin died on the ship. We know Brain and Hartnell are on Beachy. But Agluca, Captain Crozier, his body has never been identified among the bones. His uniform has never been found. Did he die in the camp, or did he keep walking? There is one persistent, haunting Inuit legend that says Agluca did not die on the field of ghosts, that he and perhaps one other man were seen years later, alive.
In the vast library of tragedy that is the Franklin expedition, there is one volume that remains unwritten: the story of the survivor. Official history tells us that by 1848, or perhaps 1849, every single member of the crew was dead. The British Admiralty closed the book. They declared that all 129 men had perished in the ice. But the Inuit tell a different story. For generations, elders have passed down the tale of Agluca. They say that while the other white men lay down and died, Agluca did not. He was the chief, the man with the gold braid on his cap, the man who carried the long glass, a telescope, and a gun. The oral histories are specific.
They say that Agluca led the last group of survivors away from the place of the bones. They crossed the ice to the mainland. They walked south, deep into the Canadian tundra. Years after the ships were abandoned, Inuit hunters in the area of the Great Fish River reported seeing a white man. He was alone, or perhaps with one or two others. He was dragging a sledge. He was hunting. This is a startling detail. The other sailors had starved because they couldn't hunt. They didn't know how to catch seals or shoot caribou. They relied on their tins, and then their boots, and then each other. But Agluca, apparently, had learned. He was seen shooting geese. He was seen eating deer meat. The description of him is haunting. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by years of ice. He spoke a mixture of English and broken Inuktitut. He made signs with his hands. He was trying to get to Iwilik, the Inuit name for the area near Repulse Bay, where he believed he would find whalers, or perhaps the Hudson's Bay Company outpost. He was walking home.
Is it possible that Francis Crozier, the seasoned Irish captain, survived the massacre at Starvation Cove? It is historically plausible. Crozier was the most experienced polar traveller on the expedition. He spoke some Inuktitut from his previous voyages. He respected the Inuit. If anyone could have adapted, it was him. The Inuit legends say that Agluca spent a winter with them. Imagine the scene: a captain of the Royal Navy, the last remnant of the British Empire, living in a sealskin tent with a nomadic family. He would have been a curiosity, a ghost, a man who had lost his entire world. The legends say that he was sad. He would sit for hours staring south. He would look through his telescope, scanning the horizon for masts that never appeared. He tried to explain to his hosts who he was. He drew pictures in the snow, pictures of ships with smoke, pictures of big houses. But the cultural gap was too wide. To the Inuit, he was just a man who had come from the ice. Eventually, the urge to return to his own kind became too strong. The legends say that Agluca packed his sledge. He took his gun, he took his telescope, and he said goodbye. He walked south into the vast, empty, barren lands of Canada, and he was never seen again.
If the stories are true, Francis Crozier may have lived until 1850, or even 1851. He may have been the last man standing, fully aware that he was the sole survivor of the greatest disaster in exploration history. The psychological weight of that solitude is impossible to imagine. To walk alone across a continent, knowing that 128 of your friends are lying dead behind you, knowing that you ate them to survive, knowing that you failed. Searchers in the 19th century, like Charles Francis Hall, were obsessed with finding Agluca. Hall believed fiercely that survivors were still alive in the 1860s, living with the Inuit. He travelled to the Arctic. He interviewed everyone he could find. He offered rewards, but he found only silence and relics. He found a spoon with Crozier's crest. He found a watch, but he never found the man. The fate of Agluca remains the final mystery. Did he die in a snowbank just a few hundred miles from safety? Did he fall through the ice? Or, as some darker theories suggest, did he eventually run out of ammunition and succumb to the wolves? We will likely never find his bones. The barren lands are vast.
they swallow everything. But the legend of Agluca adds a final, tragic note to the symphony of the Franklin expedition. It suggests that the horror didn't end with a bang or a mass death. It ended with a single, lonely figure, limping across the white world, refusing to give up until the very last beat of his heart. But while Agluca was walking south, back in England, the woman who loved the expedition's leader was fighting a different battle. A battle not against ice, but against time and memory. We return now to London, to the drawing room of Lady Jane Franklin, the woman who refused to wear black.
While the Arctic wind buried the bones of the crew, a different kind of storm was raging in London. Lady Jane Franklin was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. When the Admiralty finally gave up the search in 1854, declaring the men dead and paying John Ray his reward, she refused to let the story end there. She refused to let her husband be remembered as the man who ate his crew or the man who failed. She launched a campaign that would make modern public relations firms look amateur. She didn't just want to find the ships, she wanted to craft a legacy. She spent her own fortune and raised money from the public to fund one final expedition. She hired Captain Francis McClintock, the man who would eventually find the Victory Point note and the skeleton of Harry Peglar. But her instructions to McClintock were clear. He was to go north, confirm the death of her husband, but more importantly, he was to find proof of his success. She needed the world to believe that Franklin had discovered the Northwest Passage before he died. It was a technicality. The men had indeed reached a point where the known maps connected. They had forged the link, but they had done it while dying, trapped in the ice, unable to sail through. To Lady Jane, the details didn't matter. The narrative did. She turned John Franklin into a martyr for science, a Christian knight who had sacrificed himself for the empire. She wore bright colours to parties. She courted the press. She wrote poems. She built a myth so strong that it completely overshadowed the gruesome reality of the field of ghosts.
When McClintock returned in 1859 with the Victory Point note, confirming Franklin's death date, Lady Jane finally accepted her widowhood. But she didn't retreat into silence. She solidified the legend in bronze and marble. If you walk through London today, you can see the results of her work. In Waterloo Place, just a short walk from the Royal Society, stands a towering bronze statue of Sir John Franklin. He is standing tall, looking noble, dressed in his naval uniform. Beneath him, bronze reliefs depict his funeral, a solemn, dignified affair on the ice. It looks nothing like the sliding of a canvas bag into a black hole. It looks like a state funeral. But it is the inscription on the statue that truly reveals Lady Jane's victory. To the great Arctic navigator and his brave companions who sacrificed their lives in completing the discovery of the Northwest Passage. Completing. She had won. History would remember him as the discoverer, not the failure. She placed a bust of him in Westminster Abbey. She placed a plaque in the Royal Naval College. She ensured that every child in England learned the name Franklin as a synonym for hero. The cannibalism, the lead poisoning, the madness, the boots filled with meat, those were whispered rumours, dark gossip spread by the unreliable John Ray. The official story, the story carved in stone, was one of stoic Christian suffering.
Lady Jane Franklin died in 1875. She passed away believing that she had saved her husband's soul from the judgment of history. And for a long time, she had. For over a century, the world preferred her version. We preferred the statue in Waterloo Place to the cut marks on the bones. We preferred the idea of the white hero conquering the ice to the reality of the smiling dead man in the dark ship. She was the architect of memory. She understood that history is not just what happens, it is what we choose to remember. But the ice is patient. It holds on to things longer than marble does. Lady Jane could control the newspapers, she could control the statues, but she couldn't control the biology of the men buried on Beachy Island. She couldn't control the preservation of the ships in the freezing water. She built a beautiful lie, but the truth was waiting in the DNA of John Torrington and in the glass windows of the HMS Terror. And now, 170 years later, the ice has finally decided to speak. We have reached the end of the long walk. The ships have been found, the bodies have been named, the mystery is solved. But there is one final reflection to make. A look at what this story truly means for us, sitting in our warm rooms, listening to the wind outside. What is the true legacy of the terror on the ice?
We have reached the end of the ice. Looking back at the tragedy of the Franklin expedition, it is easy to see it as a horror story. A story of cannibalism, madness, and monsters made of lead and cold. But it is also a story about us, about the fragility of the world we build for ourselves. The Victorians were the masters of the 19th century. They built railways that crossed continents. They built factories that churned out steel. They mapped the stars. They believed, truly believed, that there was no force in nature that could not be tamed by British engineering and Christian morality. The Erebus and Terror were the ultimate expression of that belief. They were floating cathedrals of science. And yet the Arctic stripped them bare. It didn't care about their steam engines. It didn't care about their silver cutlery. It didn't care about their titles or their ranks. In the end, the unsinkable ships were crushed by frozen water, the perfect food was poison, and the civilized men were reduced to the most primal state imaginable. It is a humbling reminder. We surround ourselves with technology, with walls, with heating systems. We think we have conquered the night, but the night is always waiting just outside the glass. The silence of King William Island is not empty. It is heavy with the weight of that lesson. It whispers that civilization is a thin veneer, a coat of paint over the raw wood of survival, and if the temperature drops low enough, that paint cracks.
Today, the Erebus and Terror are protected sites. They sit quietly on the ocean floor, visited only by divers and marine biologists. The water around them is cold, preserving the wood, keeping the secrets locked in the captain's desk. The bodies on Beachy Island, Torrington, Hartnell, Brain, sleep in their blocks of ice. They are the eternal witnesses, young men who went looking for glory and found only the winter. And Agluca, the strider? He is out there still, a ghost walking the barren lands, a symbol of the human will to keep going even when all hope is lost. When the wind howls across the tundra, the Inuit elders say you can still hear the crunch of boots on snow. You can still hear the rattle of the silver forks in the boat.
It is the sound of ghosts trying to get home. But perhaps they are home. They have become part of the landscape they tried to conquer. They are the wind. They are the ice. They are the silence.
So, tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, safe from the cold, spare a thought for the men of the ice. Think of the Royal Arctic Theatre glowing in the dark. Think of the letters written backward by a dying hand. Think of the boy in the ice with the blue handkerchief. They remind us that life is fragile, that warmth is a gift, and that no matter how far we travel or how much we build, we are all just small fires burning in a very large, very dark night. Keep your fire burning, keep your loved ones close, and never, ever take the warmth for granted. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the white. This is the Historian, signing off. Sleep well.